let's talk about shoes. Good afternoon. Originally I was going to do a video on recreation and fun during the golden age of piracy. But as I was doing research on a certain type of shoe, I realized I could probably do a shoe video. And I know a lot of folks who are trying to get into the hobby, that's something they ask about. When it comes to costuming for, I want to make an image of a historically accurate pirate, shoes are something that comes up. Let's start from right at the beginning and say pirates did not wear bucket boots. It's a trope that came from the English Civil War period. That some of the more fanciful artists within the 17th century and then later on, well past the golden age of piracy, would replicate. They kind of look cool, but practically within the context of being on a ship, landing on the shore, they're not that useful. There were sea boots at the time. They were used by at least the Spanish and the Dutch, I believe also the French. They didn't really have much of a heel. They were designed for harsh weather, usually in more colder climates than where you'd think most pirates would operate. That said, pirates did operate in the North Atlantic at various points in time, so they are not out of the realm of possibility. Is there anything definite said on it? No. And the images and depictions of them are fairly rare, just among sailors in general. But they did exist. Another item of footwear which appears among pirate fans are sandals. Yes, sandals at this time did exist, usually not in a European context. If you are doing an impression of a culture that did wear sandals, have at it. I have nothing against it. But did your average pirate, usually of Western European descent, fresh out of Europe or the American colonies, did they wear sandals? No. There is very little, if any, actually come to think of it, I don't think there is any mention of sandals. Another item that seems to crop up are some of the wicker and bark type shoes. Those would not have really fared too well in some of the climates that we are talking about. I know there are some examples from Russia. Again, this goes back to, are you portraying a Russian pirate? Which, I'm trying to think if there's any. I know there are some cultures, I know there's some countries that might have had Russian crew members. But I don't have any recollection of a Russian pirate in the golden age of piracy being mentioned. There are also some footwear that comes from North America, as well as some of the South American cultures. Moccasins, for instance, there's a few different shoe types that appear in South America. Again, within the correct context, those work. But in the correct context. Again, I have not seen any specific reference. What I have seen reference on Where are they? There they are. If you want something weird, and you are portraying a Buccaneer specifically, Buccaneer shoes did exist. Yes, these have gotten a little bit flat, but they're still wearable. Now, as I said in the Don't Eat the Leather video, again, do not eat these. These were made from pigskin. In this case, modern pigskin, but in the historical context, they would skin the leg of a boar, put their feet in it, and lace it up with whatever lacing they'd have on hand. And they'd let it dry, it would fit their feet. Strangely enough, as I was editing this video, I discovered that one of the shoe types which periodically shows up when historians discuss Buccaneer shoes is actually not from the Caribbean. There's a type of shoe which appears in Central and Southern Europe. Different nations use different terms for it. Which actually fits within some of the descriptions of Scottish shoes of this time period. Whoever came up with it first, I do not know, but the examples that appear on such sites as Etsy, which claim to be from the Caribbean, are actually from Central and Southern Europe. I bring this up because originally I was actually going to cite an example that periodically pops up, and as I went to look for the picture, I realized when I did a reverse Google search that, nope, in fact, that is not a Caribbean shoe type. That said, what I was saying in the video was the use of using rawhide does appear within Scottish descriptions. Quite a few Buccaneers were Scottish, whether they appeared in the Caribbean as soldiers from Cromwell's army that he sent to the Caribbean, or were later escaped indentured servants or sailors who became Buccaneers. Are the shoe types related? Very likely. But the process used by the Buccaneers is a bit different than the methods mentioned in Scottish records and also appear in Central and Southern Europe. Let's talk about the more common shoes that you would find during the Golden Age of piracy. So, starting roughly around the turn of the 17th century, Europeans started looking for a taller heel. Now, that is not to say that shoes were still not being made with a lower heel. The fashion, though, was calling for a taller heel. As an example, this would be a shoe from the early medieval period. It's actually a turn shoe. Lasted shoes were already coming into use. I figure you probably want to know what a last is. A last is that wooden block. I'm actually going to put a picture. Basically, it's used to shape the shoe to fit your foot. Believe it or not, there were left and right lasted shoes in the early part of the 17th century. And then gradually, to save time, shoemakers started doing what's called a straight last. So, notice, there is no left or right foot. Actually, you might be able to tell that from the wear pattern that there is now. It's one of the great things about traditional materials. You can get away with straight lasts because the shoe will, over time, start making itself a left or a right. Unless you switch your shoes out regularly. Now, in the modern terminology, we tend to call these shoes latchet shoes. The latchet actually refers to the lace. It's a very old term. If you Google medieval latchet shoes, you're just going to find laced shoes. somehow, I'm gonna be honest, I am not sure when the terminology shifted, but in the modern terms, people are referring to the strap. In the past, it would have been referring to the lace. These just would have been shoes. The heels, again, were one of the big points at where the 17th century and then later 18th century shoes get their shape. A lot of your shoes in the prior to that were rather low. But to support a heel, you need to start getting a little taller. It's going to give you a little more ankle support. Again, that's not to say that there weren't shoes made with lower heels in this time period. The shoes, the heels themselves became a fashion symbol. There's plenty of examples in artwork of the heel being the visible part of the heel being painted red. Men and women, actually mostly men, wore these shoes. If you were poor, though, you're not really going to use shoes like that. You would still have a heel, but it wouldn't be quite as big, especially if you're working jobs where something like that can cause you to get tripped up. That's not to say pirates wouldn't steal them. Another modern term that we tend to use when shopping for shoes is the open latchet and the closed latchet. Again, a lot of this is modern terminology. So the open style generally is seen as earlier. The truth of it is, both closed and open existed at the same time. Closed would go on. The open latchet style would die out roughly, depending on country, usually around the 1690s. You sometimes see them into the 18th century, but not so much. Let's say roughly the start of the Buccaneer period, which I'm talking about right after the English Civil War, so about 1660s and such. Yeah, you're going to see shoes like this. The Dutch, I've noticed a lot of the images of Dutch sailors, they're wearing these slightly later than some of the English sailors. These breathe a lot better because of the opening. The problem is you can also get a lot of dirt in the opening. I'm going to guess that is one of the reasons why the style went away. It also doesn't have much support for the tongue, which, these are my son's shoes. There's plenty of times where I will see him walking around and this is what's happening. These were constructed with sewn, pegged, glued, or nailed soles. Sometimes a combination of all of them. Or some of them. They are, I shouldn't say they're not the most comfortable shoe, in all honesty, but they are very practical. During the Golden Age of Piracy, in general, you see a lot larger tongue than you will with later 18th century shoes. I mean, here's an example for comparison. And even that is actually, depending on the time period, that's actually too big of a tongue for later 18th century. Out of the scope of our video. You see some size difference within the time period. There's been plenty of debates online over, was it a square toe or a round toe? I've seen both. The artifacts show both, the images show both. Some of it was a in the case of some countries, it would have been their military issue, might have required a square toe. Other places, it might just be the local manufacturer. That's all they have are square-toed lasts. Women's shoes typically were more rounded, but again, that's just a generalization. We luckily do have surviving shoes from a pirate. Well, a single shoe from a pirate and a leg bone and the stocking. John King of the Witta. His shoe is a great example because it's a very basic shoe. It shows a lot of the features that we see in the artwork. That said, it also is just one of many variations within construction of the time. Not every pirate would be wearing the same exact shoe. Not every sailor, not even naval sailors would have been wearing the same exact shoe. To close these shoes, of course, you need a buckle or laces. Laces could be made from literally whatever cordage you had laying around, or ribbon, even very fancy ribbon. Periodically you'll see online discussions over, oh, wealthier people would have had these elaborate buckles and it was the poor people who had laces. There really does not seem to be a class difference other than, again, yes, if you were wealthy and could afford a really ornate buckle, you would get that. If you were wealthy and could afford some really nice ribbon, you'd get that. It was a matter of personal taste. In my personal view, I feel like my own buckles are too plain. There are plenty of artifacts which show at least some level of engraving work in shoe buckles. If you notice, they are also a lot smaller than the later 18th century shoes. Later 18th century shoes generally will have 2 prongs, this will have 1 prong, and these are about roughly, the actual straps are about half the size. These wear out fairly if you're using them a lot and re-strapping them a lot. They will wear out over time very quickly. Shouldn't even say over time. They'll wear out relatively quickly. A lot of your laced shoes that are periodically found, they will show evidence of having had buckles at one point in time. I mean, these, for example, I'm pretty sure before the sole wears out, I'm going to end up having to lace them. Buckles are one of those things that do appear in the archaeological record. I mentioned before when I was talking about the jackets that we have very little solid examples from our time period for the lower classes. Shoes, well, shoe parts rather, are a different story. This specific style of shoe would have been worn on the later part of the 17th century up through roughly about 1730. You start to see the buckles and the tongues start changing a lot more after that period until you get to what we think of as like your typical shoe from the American Revolution. The attachments of the uppers and the vamp, they vary from just a simple slant to more supported cutout examples like this. The Witta shoe, for instance, has a cutout similar to that. There's images within, Hogarth has an image, actually one of my favorite images for looking at some of the transitions and styles, where there are a higher heel shoe that has a higher heeled shoe that has a seam like this. One of the sad parts about, again, I just mentioned it, as some of the lack of artifacts. Shoes were one of those items that would be constantly repaired up until there was nothing left to repair. Cobblers were a very important profession. There's a difference between a cobbler and a cordwainer. A cordwainer actually makes the shoe from the raw leather. Actually, typically it would be dyed leather. There were guild rules about that, depending on where you lived. Whereas the cobbler would repair the existing shoe. So, if you wanted a new shoe, you go to the cordwainer. If you wanted your shoe repaired, you'd go to the cobbler. As you saw in the opening of the video, I dabble in it a little bit. It definitely saves you money where you're not having to replace shoes constantly. You can repair them. Let's talk about mules. These are what spawned this video. I was initially going to do a video on rest, relaxation, and such, and loungewear was part of it. This type of shoe could be used as a slipper, which that's what it typically seems to have been used as in the time period. I say typically. Construction methods vary. Some of them had a wooden sole with the vamp, which this is a vamp. This is this part of the shoe. I know some folks on our Facebook page were asking me, hey, can you do a tutorial on it? I work too quickly. I typically do not get stuff filmed. Even if I have the idea while I'm working, I should film this. I'll forget halfway through and it'll be done. And this is a vamp. This is the measurement from your toe to roughly the start of your ankle, usually a little shorter. And this is the widest part of your foot. Whatever part of your foot that's going to go in here, measure that. That will give you the rough dimensions and then shape it to fit. I just taught you how to make this part of the shoe, FYI. Mules could have been made by anyone. Some examples look like they were just made by somebody with scrap fabric and a piece of wood or a piece of leather. Others were almost certainly made by a very experienced cordwainer. The way of making them varies. In this case, I went with what's essentially a turn shoe sandwiched in between an inner and an outer sole. It was the best way for me to get the shape and make sure everything was secure, as I'm likely going to be wearing these at events and want them to last. If you're wearing them as slippers, you're not going to have to worry about that sort of thing. If you're wearing them as slippers in the field, yeah, I'd recommend looking at a heavier leather construction or wood. There's an image of a blacksmith wearing these from approximately about 1740, 1750. Folks in some of these more traditional trades would have been OSHA's nightmare. Some safety gear runs the risk of becoming the problem. So you might see blacksmiths in a time period wearing gaiters and have their shoes properly secured. Then you might see others wearing mules. The reason being is if an ember gets caught in the shoe, this is a lot quicker to take off than having to take off these. Would it be safer? I'm not a blacksmith. I don't know. And I'm pretty sure even within the blacksmithing community, there's probably a debate to this day over that. Would pirates have worn mules? In one particular case, I will say yes. Stede Bonnet. the slacker pirate extraordinaire. Golden Gunpowder, I know you've given him some level of redemption, I know. I'm still going to treat him that way. He is described as wearing basically loungewear. This would have been part of 17th century loungewear. Well, 18th century in his case. So, would pirates have worn these? Yes, with an asterisk. It's very likely if they saw, given the level of theft of garments that are mentioned, it's very likely if they saw a really nice pair of slippers, they would have taken them. Another type of shoe, which I do not have an example of, but I am going to post a quick short after I mention it, are sabots and clogs. That was our crew member Deke wearing them at Fort Loudon the other weekend. These were worn typically in France, I believe in Belgium and Germany, and the Netherlands. They are a working shoe. There's a YouTuber who does carpentry. He mentioned a few weeks ago on a short that he wears them today. I have heard so many different opinions on them from people who wear them, whether they're good or bad. They were a common working shoe in this time period. Earlier or later, they were very popular. Would pirates have worn them? That's another one that has an asterisk. Given their prevalence, given the fact that within this time period there were Dutch settlements within North America, I am inclined to believe that, yes, they would have appeared. Would they have been worn on ships? I am not sure. There's enough debate over them that I'm not going to put my foot in that one. Would they have been worn on shore for messier jobs? Oh, certainly. I don't see any issue with that. If any of my Dutch viewers want to hop on and give your knowledge on it, please do. An advantage of clogs, sabots, whatever word you want to use, is that you can actually carve them to give your foot support, which I think is where some of the discussion over whether they are good shoes or bad shoes comes in. If you have terrible feet and you wear them without doing anything, yeah, they're probably going to be uncomfortable. If you have terrible feet and you carve them, they're probably going to be the best shoes you have. I hope you enjoyed the video for today. If you did, like, subscribe, leave a comment. I'm hoping that we can start getting a schedule going of doing a video at least once a week, if not twice a week, and then some shorts interspersed. We are definitely going to have a busy summer with different sites, so stay tuned. Take care.